The ring had been in her glove for 3 weeks. She had not worn it since the morning after the funeral, when she had taken it off her finger in the grey early light and set it on the dressing table and looked at it for a long time and then put it in her glove, because putting it away in a drawer was a different kind of thing, and she was not ready for that kind of thing. Not yet. The glove was the middle distance. The glove was a place to keep it while she decided what it was now, this small gold ring with the Ashton crest and the particular weight of 18 months of marriage and the larger weight of everything before and after the marriage, which was the weight she had not yet found a way to set down. It was not her ring. That was the precise truth of it. It had never been her ring in the way that a thing is yours when it comes from within your own life. It was the Ashton ring, the ring the Ashton women wore, passed from the Duke to his chosen wife at the betrothal and worn until it passed to the next. And Eleanor Voss had worn it for 18 months as Eleanor Ashton, and now she was Eleanor Voss again, which the county knew and had formed its views about, and the ring was in her glove, and she needed to give it back. She had been putting off the giving back for 3 weeks. She told herself she had been putting it off because she was still in the formal mourning period, and calling at Ashton Hall was not a thing you did during the formal mourning period, particularly not when the person you were calling on was the man who had given you the ring and whose brother you had been married to, and who was now the Duke of Ashton in his brother's place, which was a circumstance that required a particular delicacy of approach that she had not yet worked out the shape of. She told herself this with the practice of a woman who has gotten very good at believing her own practical reasons for things, and has learned not to look too closely at what is underneath them. The practical reason was true. It was also not the whole of the truth. The whole of the truth included the fact that returning the ring to Richard Ashton required seeing Richard Ashton, which required being in the same room as him, which she had not done since the funeral 3 months ago, where he had stood at the graveside and she had stood at the graveside, and there had been 6 feet of November air between them and the weight of everything that had ever been between them before the marriage, and before the engagement, and before the decision that had been made 6 years ago that had produced the engagement, and the marriage, and the 6 feet of November air, and she was not certain she had the necessary steadiness for a room with him in it. She was, on the Thursday morning when she put on her coat and took her gloves from the hall table, as steady as she was likely to be. 3 months was 3 months. The mourning was proper, and the grief was real, and she was not going to pretend otherwise to herself or to anyone, because she had been genuinely fond of Charles Ashton, and had been a good wife to him, and his death had taken something from her that she had not known she would miss as much as she did, which was the particular warmth of being known by someone, the small daily fact of a person who knew how you took your tea and what you said when something surprised you, and whether you preferred the window open or closed, and she was going to miss that for a long time. She was also, under the grief, something else, which she did not name yet, because it did not yet have a name that she was prepared to say. She drove to Ashton Hall in the small trap that had been hers before the marriage and was hers again now, and the April morning was the kind of April morning that does not care at all about the weight of what anyone is carrying, which is golden and clear and full of the noise of birds doing the urgent work of spring, and she drove through it with her hands steady on the reins and the ring solid in her glove against her palm. The hall was the same as it had always been from the outside, the grey stone and the long windows and the avenue of beeches that were just coming into leaf, pale and new, and she had driven this avenue many times in her life, first as a child when her father had brought her to the estate on business, and then as a young woman at various occasions, and then as the fiancée, and then as the wife, and now as the widow, which was the most recent category and the most complicated, because being the widow of Charles Ashton meant she had a legitimate reason to be driving this avenue, and also the most complicated possible relationship with the house at the end of it. She was shown in by the butler, whose name was Morrow, and who had known her in most of the previous categories, and who received her now with the careful gentleness of a man who has seen a great many things happen in one house over a long tenure, and has developed the ability to be present at all of them without making any of them worse. He took her coat and her outer gloves, which required her to take the ring from the right glove and move it to her hand to free the glove, and she did this without looking at Morrow, and he received her outer gloves without looking at her hand, and they were both very composed about it. She waited in the morning room, which was the room she had always been put in when she came to the hall in the previous categories, and she sat in the chair by the window and looked at the April garden and kept her hands in her lap, the right hand closed over the ring, and she was steady. Richard came in. She had prepared for this, the specific fact of him in a room, and it helped and did not help in the proportions she had expected, which was that the preparation helped, and the specific fact of him was larger than the preparation. He was 32. He had been 32 for 2 months, and she had known him for 14 years, and in those 14 years he had gone from the younger brother in his brother's house to the man beside her at the graveside, to the Duke of Ashton, in the space of a winter, and the change sat on him in the way that unwished-for changes sit on a person, which is that you can see the person clearly inside it, and you can also see the weight of it, and the seeing of both at once is the most complicated kind of seeing. He said, "Eleanor." She said, "Your Grace." He was still for a moment. He said, "You may call me Richard." She said, "You have a title now." He said, "You have never cared about titles." She said, "I care about the appropriate use of them at appropriate moments." He said, "And this is an appropriate moment." She said, "I am not certain what kind of moment this is." She said it honestly, because she was not going to perform certainty she did not have, and he looked at her with the particular quality that had always been his quality, which was that he received what was said to him without immediately producing an answer to it, which was rare, because most people produced an answer before they had finished receiving the thing, and the not immediately producing was the thing she had noticed at 12 years old and had never stopped noticing. He said, "Sit down, please." She said, "I will not stay long." He said, "Sit down anyway." She sat. He sat across from her, not behind the desk, in the chair that put them on even ground, and she noted this and said nothing about it. She said, "I have come to return the ring." She opened her right hand, and the ring was in her palm. He looked at it. He did not reach for it. He said, "You have been wearing it." She said, "I have been carrying it." He said, "You took it off." She said, "Yes." He said, "When?" She said, "The morning after the funeral." He was quiet. He said, "That was 3 months ago." She said, "Yes." He said, "You have been carrying it in your hand for 3 months." She said, "In my glove." She said, "There is a difference." He said, "What is the difference?" She said, "A drawer is the past." She said, "A glove is." She stopped. He said, "The glove is something else." She said, "Yes." He said, "What?" She looked at him across the April morning room and said, "I do not know. I did not know what to call it, and I still do not know, and I have had 3 months to think about it, and I am here now, and I still cannot name it properly." He said, "You have always been able to name things properly." She said, "Most things." She said, "I have been less successful with things that do not hold still while I am naming them." He said, "What is moving?" She looked at the ring in her hand. She said, "Everything, a little," she said. "I came here to give this back, and I find that I am sitting in this chair, and the ring is still in my hand, and I do not know what that means, and I am not accustomed to not knowing what things mean." He said, "I know." He said it quietly, and she heard the length of the knowing in it, which was 14 years. He said, "Eleanor." She said, "Yes." He said, "I am going to say something, and I would like you to hear all of it before you say anything at all, because I have been working out how to say it for 3 months, and I am not certain I will get it right, and I need you to hear it all before you respond to the part you respond to first." She looked at him. She said, "All right." He said, "When my brother came to me 6 years ago and told me he wished to marry you, I told him I was glad for him." He said, "That was a true thing. I was glad for him." He said, "It was not the whole of what was true." She was very still. He said, "I have spent 6 years being glad for him and doing the other thing quietly and separately and not troubling anyone with it, including you, because you were his wife and he was my brother, and there was no version of the other thing that was appropriate to have while those 2 facts were facts." He said, "And then he died." He said it plainly, not as a performance of grief, but as the fact of it, the hard, present fact, and she received it as a fact. He said, "And the other thing did not stop being true when he died, which I will tell you plainly, I had hoped it might, because a thing that stops when the circumstances change is a smaller thing and more manageable, and this has not been small or manageable for 6 years, and is not now." He said, "I am telling you this because you are sitting here with the ring in your hand, and you cannot tell me what the glove means, and I think you deserve the whole of what is true from my side before you decide what to do with the ring in your hand." He stopped. The morning room was very quiet. The April birds outside continued their urgent work and did not consult anyone about it. She had the ring in her palm, and her palm was closed, and she was looking at him with the full force of her attention, which had always been considerable and was now the most concentrated thing in the room. She said, "6 years." He said, "Yes." She said, "Charles did not know." He said, "Charles knew I thought highly of you." He said, "Charles did not know the rest." He said, "I did not tell him, and I do not believe he guessed, and I am not going to construct a version of my brother that is less than what he was, in order to make this easier to say. He was a good man. He loved you. He was good to you." She said, "Yes." She said, "He was." She said, "Richard." He said, "Yes." She said, 6 years ago when your brother came to me." He said, "Yes." She said, "I said yes to him." He said, "I know." She said, "I said yes to him, and I wore his ring, and I was his wife, and I am not going to construct a version of that which diminishes it." He said, "I would not want you to. I am not asking you to." She said, "Then what are you asking me?" He said, "I am not asking you anything yet." He said, "I told you I was going to say something, and you were going to hear all of it." He said, "I have not finished." She said, "Then finish." He said, "I want to ask you to stay." He said it simply, the way the most complex things are said when they have been lived with long enough that the complexity has worked its way through to the simple center of it. He said, "I want to ask you not to drive back down the avenue with the ring in your glove and put it in a drawer and be Eleanor Voss in a small house and become someone I see at county occasions and speak to carefully and with appropriate distance, because I have done that for 6 years and I know what it costs, and I am not willing to do it again with no reason for it." He said, "I know it is too soon." He said, "I know the mourning is not finished, and the grief is not finished, and I am not asking you to pretend it is. He said, I am asking you to consider the possibility that the ring in your hand is in your hand and not in a drawer because of something, and that the something is worth attending to, and that you might stay and attend to it, and I will not press you, and I will not hurry you, and I will wait for as long as waiting is what is needed, and I am telling you that plainly so that you know the terms. She looked at him for a long time. She said, You have been working on this for 3 months. He said, Longer. He said it quietly, and she understood that longer meant 6 years of the other thing, the thing done quietly and separately, and she thought about 6 years, and about the brother at the graveside, and about what it had cost him to stand there, and what it had cost him to come in here and say it, and she thought that the cost was considerable, and that the saying of it without embellishment or performance was the bravest thing she had seen anyone do in a long time, and possibly ever. She said, I took the ring off the morning after the funeral. He said, Yes. She said, I told myself I took it off because I was the widow and not the wife anymore, and it was not my ring to wear. He said, Yes. She said, That was true. He said, Yes. She said, It was not the whole of the truth. He was very still. She said, The whole of the truth is that I took it off because wearing it had become complicated in a way I did not have a name for, and I put it in the glove because the glove was the middle distance, and I have been in the middle distance for 3 months, and I drove here this morning to give it back and close the middle distance, and I find that I cannot. He said, Why not? She said, Because you said it was 6 years, and I am sitting here thinking that 6 years ago when your brother came to me, I was 20, and I said yes to the Duke's proposal, because it was the right thing to say, and because I was fond of him, and because the alternative was to think about something I had not yet worked out how to think about, and I put that something in the same place as the ring, which was the middle distance, and I have been there for 6 years. He said, Eleanor. She said, Let me finish. He said, Yes. She said, I was a good wife. He said, Yes. She said, And I grieve him. He said, Yes. She said, And I am also sitting here, and you have said the thing you said, and the ring is in my hand, and I find that I cannot tell you whether to take it back, and I think that means something, and I think it has meant something for longer than 3 months. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, How much longer? She said, I do not know exactly. She said, I have been in the middle distance for some time, and time is harder to measure from there. He said, Yes. He said, I know that too. She looked at the ring. She said, You said you would wait. He said, Yes. She said, You said you would not press and not hurry. He said, Yes. She said, Then I would like to give you the ring to hold. He looked at her. She said, Not to keep. She said, Not to put away. She said, To hold, because I am not ready to put it on my hand, and I am not willing to put it in a drawer, and the middle distance is a glove, and I would like to give it to something more solid than a glove, while I find the name for what the middle distance contains. He was still for a long moment, and then he put his hand out, and she placed the ring in his palm, and his hand closed over it, and he said, I will hold it as long as you need. She said, That may be some time. He said, I have been doing the other thing for 6 years. He said, I have some practice at the longer duration. She said, That is not a comfortable thing to have said. He said, No. He said, It is accurate, which is more useful than comfortable in most cases. She said, You sound like someone I know. He said, You have always been direct, and I have always found it easier to be direct in return. She said, Most people find it less easy. He said, Most people have not been trying not to say a particular direct thing for 6 years, he said. The pressure builds. She looked at him with something that was not quite a smile, but was the beginning of the territory around one, and he received it with the same, and they sat in the April morning room with the ring in his hand and the birds outside continuing their urgent work, and neither of them said the next thing, because the next thing was not needed yet, and they both understood that. And the understanding of it was itself the clearest sign that they were in a different kind of territory now, the territory past the saying of the necessary things, where what was needed was not words but time, and time was the one thing both of them had in quantities sufficient to the purpose. She came back on a Tuesday. She had told herself she was coming to discuss the East Meadow drainage question, which was a legitimate concern for the estate, and which touched a piece of land her late husband had been managing with her input, and which required some resolution now that the dukedom had changed hands. And this was true, and was not the whole of the truth, and she was getting more comfortable with knowing the difference, and not requiring the whole of the truth to precede every action she took. Richard was in the estate office when she arrived, and he was surrounded by the papers that a new duke accumulates, which are substantial and various and do not reduce themselves simply. And he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who has been in estate papers for 4 hours and has just been given something worth looking at. And she said, "The East Meadow." He said, "Yes, sit down." She sat, and they talked about the East Meadow for 40 minutes, which was the legitimate concern, and was also the easiest conversation she had had in 3 months, because it was about something real, and they both understood it, and they had always been able to talk about real things, had been talking about real things since she was 12 and he was 18, and her father had brought her to the estate on business, and he had found her in the library reading the wrong section, and had told her so, and she had told him why it was not the wrong section, and they had argued about it for an hour, and he had told her afterward that she was wrong, but interestingly so, which was the most accurate compliment she had received in her 12 years of life. She came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. She did not always have an estate reason, and she stopped pretending she did, because the pretending was a habit from the middle distance, and she was trying to leave the middle distance. They walked the park on one Thursday, because the spring was doing what spring does, and it seemed wasteful to be inside. And she told him about the year she had spent in the north with her aunt, after her father died, and he told her about the 18 months he had spent managing the Scottish properties after Charles's first illness, which she had not known about in its full detail, and which told her something about the 18 months she had been living in the Hall while he had been in Scotland, which was more than she had known, and which she needed time to think about. She thought about it over a week, and came back and asked him about it, and he told her, and she listened in the way he always listened to her, without immediately producing an answer, and when he was done, she said, "I did not know you were managing it alone." He said, "There was no reason for you to know." She said, "There was every reason for me to know." He said, "You were married to my brother, and the Scottish properties were my concern, and I was not going to bring my concerns to you." She said, "I would have been glad if you had." He said, "Yes." He said, "I know that now." She said, "Richard." He said, "Yes." She said, "We have wasted a great deal of time." He said, "Yes." He said, "I know." He said, "I have been aware of the waste for some time, and have not known how to address it without doing something I could not do." She said, "I know." She said, "I am not blaming you." She said, "I am observing it." He said, "Yes." He said, "I find your observations useful, generally." She said, "Generally." He said, "There are occasional exceptions." She said, "Name one." He said, 12 years old, in the library. The argument about Aristotle. She said, I was right about Aristotle. He said, you were entirely right about Aristotle, and the exception is that at 18 years old, I was not able to tell a 12-year-old girl she was right without feeling the full ridiculousness of having spent 3 years reading the wrong section myself. She said, you were embarrassed. He said, I was young. She said, that is not an answer. He said, it is a context. She looked at him in the April afternoon and thought that the 12-year-old in the library and the woman in the morning room with the ring in her hand were the same person, and that the 18-year-old who had argued about Aristotle and the man who had said it was 6 years were the same person, and that 14 years was a long time, and also the exact right amount of time for something that had needed to be this specific and this steady, to have had enough time to become what it was, which was the thing in the middle distance that now had a name, and the name was not complicated at all. It was very simple, and the simplicity of it was what she had been putting in the glove for 3 months, because simple things are the hardest to say, she said. The ring. He looked at her. He was still for a moment, and then he reached into his waistcoat pocket and held it out, and it lay in his palm in the afternoon light, the same as it had lain in her palm in the morning room, the small gold ring with the crest, and she looked at it. She said, you have been carrying it. He said, in my pocket. She said, every day. He said, I told you I would hold it. She said, yes. She said, I thought you would put it somewhere. He said, I said I would hold it. He said, I am particular about words. She looked at the ring, and then she looked at him, and she said, I would like to wear it again. He said, Eleanor. She said, I would like to wear it as mine, if it can be mine, which requires it to be given, not returned, which is a different thing, and I would like it to be different this time. He said, yes. He said, I would like it to be different this time. She said, I am not going to be easy. He said, I know. She said, I have opinions, and I say them, and I am not going to stop saying them for the appropriate uses of titles or for any other reason. He said, I have been waiting 14 years for you to say your opinions directly at me, and I intend to find it the opposite of difficult. She said, you have had a sample of them this spring. He said, yes. He said, the East Meadow, the Scottish properties, the argument about whether the North Avenue needed a 3rd row of beeches. She said, it does not need a 3rd row. He said, the estate forester thinks otherwise. She said, the estate forester has not stood in the avenue in April and seen how the 2 rows come into leaf and understood that a 3rd row would close the sky. He said, I will tell him you have made the argument. She said, tell him I am right. He said, tell him yourself. He said, you will be in a better position to tell him yourself shortly. She looked at the ring in his hand. She said, give it to me properly. He said, yes. He took her hand, her left hand, and he placed the ring on her finger, the way you place a ring when you are giving it for the first time and not returning it, which is with the full weight of the intention behind it, and she let it settle and looked at it on her hand in the afternoon light, and it looked different than it had looked for the 18 months of the marriage, and she thought that the same object could look entirely different depending on the angle from which it was given, and that the angle this time was the right one, the one she had been in the middle distance waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it, and that the middle distance was over, and that what came next was not a middle anything but a direct line from here to wherever they were going, and she was very good with direct lines, had always been better with them than with the middle distances that other people seemed to find more comfortable, and she was going to take this one with the full force of her attention and not waste any more of it on approximations and arrangements, and the edges of things. He said, "I would like to say something." She said, "You have been saying things for 3 months, one careful thing at a time." He said, "Yes." He said, "This one is simple." She said, "Say it then." He said, "I have loved you since the library." He said it without embellishment and without apology, which was the only possible way to say a true thing that had been true for 14 years and had been kept in the middle distance almost as long as the ring. She said, "I know." He looked at her. She said, "I know, because a person who reads Aristotle properly for 3 years does not feel ridiculous about being corrected by a 12-year-old unless she already matters to him in a specific way." He said, "That is a very considered analysis of a 20-year-old event." She said, "I have had time." He said, "You have been analyzing this for some time." She said, "I have been in the middle distance for some time, and the middle distance is a very good place for analysis, if not for anything else." He said, "And now," she said, "and now I have the ring on my hand, and I would very much like to be out of the middle distance and somewhere with a direct line and sufficient light." He said, "The avenue is in full leaf," she said. "Then take me to the avenue," he said. "Yes." He offered his arm, and she took it, which was the simplest possible thing, and also, as simple things generally are, the whole of what was needed. And they went out into the April afternoon, where the beeches were in their new pale leaf, and the sky between them was exactly as open as she had said it was, exactly as it should be, which was wide and clear and full of the particular light that April keeps for the people who have finally come out of the middle distance and into it. Thank you for listening to this story, all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from and what the story made you feel. Do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next one.